colleagues. I'm really delighted to be here. Though I must admit, I hope I will have something new to say because I was here only a few weeks ago as a guest of the Latin American Studies Institute in another context where several of you were present. But thank you. I hope, have something different to say today. But before I go into my substantive remarks, even though I think we're a little bit behind on the clock, but since I am in some way part of the Global South, and many of you from the Global South, we know we are not necessarily bound to what is the punctuality of the German world. So I think let us relax and say, well, things are going as they go. I am very honored to be here and really very impressed with this initiative on the part of the German Ministry of Education and Culture. I've heard about it because I've been here for a year or so, but I see now its full vision, and I see the investment that has been made in this particular Marian Center. I couldn't help reflecting on the connections or links between the remarkable woman for whom these centers are named and Alexander von Humboldt in terms of the interest in science in Latin America. I'm sure a lot has been written about that, but my first glimpse of another giant figure, this time a woman, from an earlier time in German history, linking up to Latin America as well as to natural science and more. Anyway, the partnerships here are remarkable. I have friends and acquaintances because of my long mileage in this field in, I think, many of these institutions, in Köln, in the Colegio, in Sao Paulo, and in other parts of Latin America, like Argentina, where I will be going soon after a long, long break. It's too late in my career to become a Latin Americanist, alas, but were I 30 years younger, I'd be seriously thinking about that, given all these exciting collaborations and developments. But congratulations and very good luck with this extraordinary enterprise. And with those words, I'll launch into reading my paper, which I will try to also perhaps shrink in the interests of your patience and your appetite for dinner, but I have a contract, so I will do my job. I think it wouldn't be fair to say what actually can be done with most talks, where one can give the talk essentially in 5 minutes, but we are allotted some more time, so we take our time. So first, the field of debate. So the title is The Risks of Dialogue. I just remind you, for those of you who may not recall the title, that is the title of my talk today. And it draws on work that I've done, some of which you were kind enough to mention, so this is not kind of new research, but certainly an effort to pull together some of my interests in a slightly different way, given this context and today's context. So first, the field of debate. When cosmopolitanism is debated in scholarly circles, as it has intensely been in the last 15 years or so, slums, urban poverty, and global deprivation rarely enter the picture, except to remind us that cosmopolitanism is an elite privilege and debating it is likewise an elite luxury. There are reasons for this bias, and they are to be found in our common understandings about what cosmopolitanism actually is. Most definitions of cosmopolitanism, either directly or indirectly, assume that it is a certain cultivated knowledge of the world beyond one's immediate horizons and is the product of deliberate activities associated with literacy, the freedom to travel, and the luxury of expanding the boundaries of one's own self by expanding its experiences. For this reason, cosmopolitanism is usually contrasted with various forms of rootedness and provincialism, the latter associated with attachment to one's own friends, one's own group, one's own language, one's own country, and even one's own class, and a certain lack of interest in crossing those boundaries. The cosmopolitan is often identified with the exile, the traveler, and the seeker of the new, who is not content with his or her historically derived identity, biography, and cultural values. In today's world, cosmopolitanism is loosely associated with post-national sensibilities, a global ethos, multicultural politics and values, and a generalized openness to cultural experimentation, hybrid identities, and international cultural transfers and exchanges. This set of associations is hardly the same as the universalism of the Enlightenment, but it has some affinities with it in its common interest in an expanded idea of humanity which transcends the boundaries of nation and ethnos. Today, I wish to suggest that a rather different sort of cosmopolitanism can be discerned in the world of internally generated forms of activism incubated among the world's poorest populations. This would be one of my examples, more or less independent of advanced education and privileged access to the means of travel, leisure, and informed self-cultivation. That is the whole ethos of Bildung. Nevertheless, what I call, and I have written about this, cosmopolitanism from below has in common with the more privileged form of cosmopolitanism the urge to expand one's current horizons of self and cultural identity and a wish to connect with a wider world in the name of values which in principle could belong to anyone and apply in any circumstance. This vernacular cosmopolitanism also resists the boundaries of class, neighborhood, and mother tongue, but it does so without an abstract valuation of the idea of humanity or of the world as a generally known or knowable place. This is a variety of cosmopolitanism that begins close to home and builds on the practices of the local, the everyday, and the familiar, but is imbued with a politics of hope that requires the stretching of the boundaries of the everyday in a variety of political directions. It builds towards global affinities and solidarities through an irregular assortment of near and distant experiences, and neither assumes nor denies the value of its universality or the universality of its values. Its aim is to produce a preferred geography of the global by the strategic extension of local cultural horizons, not in order to dissolve or deny the intimacy of the local, but in order to combat its indignities and exclusions. It is thus closely tied to the politics of hope and the promise of democracy as a space of dignity as well as of equality. It is indeed correct to call this style of life, I believe, cosmopolitan, but it is cosmopolitanism driven by the exigencies of exclusion rather than by the privileges and ennui of inclusion. It's what I've also elsewhere called compulsory cosmopolitanism. So, briefly, let me talk about the cosmopolitanism of the urban poor as an example of this compulsory cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitanism from below. Now, I've written in various books and essays quite a bit about my work with the urban, the very poor, essentially unhoused poor of the city of Mumbai. Some of you may know this work, some of you may not, but I'll just very quickly give you a sketch and then tell you what I learned or how I began to think about cosmopolitanism from below or compulsory cosmopolitanism after my work with these slum dwellers, which began in around the year 2000. So it's 15 or 17 years now, but the most intensive phase was in the early 2000s. And then I've written about it, and I work with that alliance of people still, which is an alliance I spent most time with in Mumbai, but the Mumbai group is part of an Indian network, and the Indian network is part of a global network called Slum or Shack Dwellers International, SDI. 40 countries, 20 or 30 in 20 of them, perhaps 25 in the African continent, many in Asia, a few in Latin America and the Middle East. Massive transnational, non-governmental activist network of urban slum dwellers, many women. So my focus, I spent time with this alliance in South Africa, as well as in the Philippines, as well as in India, but my main focus was on their formation in India, which was the beginning of this large network. The next I was to South Africa, and then they moved to other places. That's a long story, I won't go into many details now. In Mumbai, the alliance, which they actually use the term for themselves, alliance, is of three key groups. One is called the National Slum Dwellers Federation, NSDF. It's largely male and it's national, but it has a strong Bombay presence and certain specific ethnic qualities in its leadership and composition that I'll say a word about in a minute. The second group is called Mahila Milan. Mahila means women, Milan means meeting, so meeting of women. It's a women's organization whose roots lie in women who became slum activists who were previously sex workers in a particular neighborhood of Mumbai and lived and still live in 2017, often on the pavement, in regularized spaces that they have had for a long time, but which are still insecure, which could be demolished, which could be destroyed, which have no title in Hernando de Soto sense. These are not small little capitalists living with a small property. There is nothing. Women have lived there both when they were sex workers and now many of them are grandmothers. They've long left that profession, but they are right in the same area. They form this women's organization. Finally, there's an organization called Spark, which is a NGO more in the recognizable Western mode, middle-class women who had social work or other training, an interest in the urban poor. And these three groups came together, formed this alliance in the late 1900s, early 2000s, but then built up ties with South Africa and so on, and now are a very large network. So in Mumbai, which is where most of my fieldwork has been, I was impressed with the fact that the urban slum dwellers who were part of this organization, and they were part of the mosaic of urban poverty in Mumbai, were essentially a population of roughly 15 million. I would say 6 to 8, 50%, have no good housing. And of that 50%, another 50% is living in extremely insecure temporary housing on the pavement. So if you fly into Mumbai, if anybody has had the experience of flying into Mumbai, you will see an ocean of blue tarpaulin everywhere. It's not the favelas, it's not here and then there something else. No, it's everywhere. Mumbai is the size of Manhattan, and Greater Mumbai is the size of New York City, including the boroughs, roughly. You will see these blue concentrations, which are slums, temporary housing, illegal, unofficial, etc., everywhere in the city, from above, and that is the case. So 50% of a city of 15 million living with no secure housing. So housing rights are the key of this particular group, the key political interest. And again, I've written at length about this, but I want to today only talk about the question of cosmopolitanism that I learned from these men and women who, as I say, come to Mumbai, or their families came to Mumbai, or their forebears, their parents came to Mumbai from many very different parts of India. Many from Hyderabad in the south, many from Chennai, the Madras region in the south, others from Muslim regions in the north. So Hindus, Muslims, Tamil speakers, Telugu speakers, Urdu speakers, extraordinary linguistic diversity across this set of very poor people, which means that to work together, they right away have to engage each other's languages. So just forgetting the rest of the power hierarchy among themselves, they have to bridge the language connection. So many of these people, who are often illiterate, are in fact multilingual, speak 3 languages and sometimes a smattering of English and so on and so forth. Remarkable, but not again chosen as part of a Bildung exercise, obviously, chosen as or pursued as part of the reproductive and political and cultural survival. In addition to the traffic among each other, for example, Hindi or Urdu speaking ex-sex workers in the women's organization, and Tamil slum-dwelling males from another part of Mumbai who do not speak Hindi but speak Tamil, but of course also become bi and trilingual, but originally, as we were speaking very different languages. That is a key to the bond that makes this alliance very strong, but it's across gender, language, and regional boundaries inside India. So you don't have to go very far to see extraordinary diversity being negotiated, even internal to this alliance. Next, of course, they have to deal with the police. They have to deal with slum landlords. They have to deal with developers. They have to do with municipal officials. They have to deal with people who allow or don't allow them to build toilets, which, by the way, in these communities, very often there's a toilet for 800 people, 4 times the size of this room, waiting for one toilet. And if you're very lucky, you'll have a building with 10 toilets, 10 seats to defecate, with 4 times this population all having to go to work at 7:30 in the morning, lined up. This is common situation. So building of toilets, building of housing are closely connected, but all of them require that you have to negotiate with people who speak other languages. Speak Hindi, speak Marathi, which is the language of the state in which Mumbai is the capital. Hindi is the national language. And your own community speaks many other languages. Other officials speak yet other languages. So I focus on language, but indeed what it means is that you have to negotiate with all kinds of other cultural practices in order to get from today to tomorrow, in order to have any chance of fulfilling your ambitions to get organized, to do collective savings, to put pressure on the state. That is their general politics, but all of it requires negotiation, and in the spirit of the Merian Center, it is all negotiation done under the conditions of asymmetry, not of equality. So when you're dealing with a policeman and trying to speak some common language among your shared languages, it is not, it's a little bit like Radcliffe Brown, the great anthropologist who studied kinship in the Andaman Islands, and his way of doing kinship was to bring a Negrito, a native, to his balcony with 2 large Indian soldiers standing with a stick, and then he would ask them kinship terms, So it's that kind of, it's not a relaxed atmosphere and not equal atmosphere. So these are the conditions which I call compulsory in terms of expansion of your life world. But this expansion in Mumbai leads then to contact with poor women in other cities in India. And starting in 2000, poor women from Cape Town, poor women from Kathmandu, all coming to Mumbai, organized by this network, and exchanging music, urban experiences, housing plans, etc., with their counterparts. So it goes global, but it begins very close to home, the fact that you have to stretch your boundaries. So I could say a great deal more about the Mumbai environment, language, and so on, but I will not, and I will only say that these people are certainly cosmopolitan, but in all the manners that I've tried to hint at, this is cosmopolitanism that is compulsory, that is required for survival, and that is very hard won, and that is pursued and kept alive, both as a matter of relatively equal collaboration within the movement and totally asymmetric dialogue with the powers that be. Corporations, developers, municipality, police, all of whom are breathing down the necks of these communities. Now, I want to move to a very different example now and focus on the risk question, and then I'll try and connect the 2 examples. So in this second part of my talk, I'll try equally briefly to give you some general ideas why I talk of the risk of dialogue, and I'm going to take these examples from the last 10 or 15 years in Europe, where the question of Islam obviously has become central to the question of negotiation with the other. So the cultural strategies of the urban poor in Mumbai can be understood as a kind of dialogue with each other and with those who hold power over them. Especially in these asymmetric situations, no one can enter into dialogue without taking serious risks. This view, which I hold, is opposed to the common sense view of dialogue as casual, quotidian, even secondary to the real workings of power and wealth. If we can agree that dialogue is always a risky affair, we can ask ourselves what risks are involved and why it is worthwhile, even compulsory, for the poor, the subaltern, and the marginalized to take these risks today. That is, including the case I talked about, but other cases as well, many of which you will know better about than I. because they come from the Latin American world. I use the term dialogue here to refer to any sort of effort to negotiate between parties that are not culturally similar, that are in unequal power relations, typically, and that have to learn together in some sort of what I call contested conviviality. I will return to this term, contested conviviality, in my conclusion. But let me say something about the risks now. I've hinted at some of them in my example of the urban poor, but with Islam in Europe, you can see it even more clearly because it's a kind of macro case, and it's in the media, it's highly articulated, and so on. The first risk of dialogue is that the other party, whether the party is a person, a community, an organization, a state, whatever it may not understand what you mean. This we understand. The risk of misunderstanding is inherent to all human communication, and we have evolved many ways to reduce these risks. We try to choose our words and actions carefully. We pay attention to language and translation. We try to imagine the mental assumptions of the other party. In short, we try to be as intersubjective as possible and to find the best ways to cross the boundaries between the speaker and the listener. We do this all the time in everyday life, and all sorts of organizations do the same thing. Needless to say, when we conduct dialogue in earnest, we also try to listen with the same mental approach so as to minimize the risks of misunderstanding or miscommunication. So speaker and listener are both engaged in this effort. The second risk of dialogue is exactly the opposite, and that is the risk that we may in fact be understood clearly. This paradox is partly based on the worry that the other party may see through our surface expressions and understand motives or intentions which we prefer to conceal. That is always a hazard in the era of the epistemology of suspicion coming out of Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. But the deeper risk of being fully understood is the risk that the other party will actually see our deepest convictions, our foundational opinions, and even our doubts. The reason why this is a risk is that dialogue is not about everything. To be effective, dialogue must be, to some extent, about shared ground, selective agreement, and provisional consensus. When foundational convictions come onto the table, the improvisational element of dialogue is endangered, and the stakes become impossibly high, since basic convictions have to be made commensurable. One major example is, indeed, the dialogue between the Islamic world and the Christian European world, going on now in a very dramatic manner in the last 15 years, but actually going on for some centuries, in which dialogue too quickly moves to doctrinal and ethical foundations without paying attention to more specific and limited arenas. A struggle over headscarves in schools need not become a struggle over competing views of human universality. It can remain a problem of public conduct or etiquette. So when we undertake dialogue, we must take care not to demand too much understanding or to offer too much of our deepest convictions. I am aware that this sounds like a suggestion that we must be hypocritical or cynical. In fact, I'm suggesting prudence and limited agreement. When we undertake dialogue, an even greater risk than the risk of misunderstanding, as I say, is the risk of excess understanding. So let's look a little more closely at this. Complete, full, and precise mutual understanding is an impossible standard in any case, given the challenges of culture, language, and history that divide, especially in our world, individuals and communities. But complete understanding at the level of primary ethical, religious, or political convictions carries yet another danger with it. That danger is the urge to eliminate basic differences altogether. For if we wish to establish common ground at the level of basic convictions, somebody's basic convictions must change. And this usually means that one party's deepest convictions become the measure of common ground. This is the way in which false universalisms can erase true differences. So dialogue must always involve a decision about how far to demand negotiation about fundamentals. In this sense, all dialogue is a form of negotiation, and negotiation cannot be based on complete mutual understanding or a total consensus across any sort of boundary or difference. There is yet another risk associated with dialogue, and that is the relationship of dialogue to internal differences on each side of the dialogue. All individuals have inner doubts, differences, and divisions within themselves. such as, for example, between short and long-term goals, higher and lesser motives, conscious and unconscious interests, and so on. When we move up the scale to groups, communities, civilizations, and other large social formations, we have in addition the internal differences between the old and the young, the elite and the common people, between the court and the street, men and women, to name only the simplest categories of internal division. In the age of globalization, these internal differences are further exacerbated by the movement of migrants to new locations, the different identity anxieties of old and young among migrant populations, and of course the nature of mass media and electronic communication, which allows intensely local and highly remote attachments to be co-present and mutually formative. So, in contemporary Europe, it is evident that these risks are all real. Islam is too often represented as monolithic, as not having room for dissent, debate, or difference. On the other hand, opponents of Islamic fundamentalism often deny the deep divisions underneath the liberal consensus between those who are for or against the European Union, between those who come out of Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish traditions, between those who have become thoroughly secularized and those who have not, between those who have come to embrace the religion of the market and those who have not, between votaries of fast and slow food, and between supporters and opponents of the welfare state. The real challenge is to choose among all these debates and decide which ones are appropriate to bring into a true dialogue. Many of you who know India know that one of the big issues in the relationship of Muslim communities and the larger Muslim community to the largely Hindu-dominated state is the question of internal inequality within Muslim communities, particularly regarding the status of women. So we have the great famous case, Shah Banu case, which was all about a woman's right to divorce and so on, but being suppressed, that argument being suppressed by the Muslim community itself, which is, of course, dominated by males in India as elsewhere. So the question is, when that Muslim community has to negotiate with the Indian state or the Indian legal structure, how much space do they give for their own internal dissent? And what's the point at which that becomes very, very risky? This is a risk for both sides in any such debate, because everybody has internal differences. So here what I want to say simply is to say we cannot avoid, if we wish to move away from the misleading and dangerous idea of a clash of civilizations, especially where Islam is concerned, it is important to recognize that all dialogue is risky and that no great tradition or ideology is lacking in internal debate. So remember, the risk of being misunderstood, the risk of being too much understood, and then the risk of how to balance your internal differences when you come to the table with your difference with the external other who is on the other side of the table, who has the same internal debate problem. So which pieces do you bring to the table and negotiate over? So let me say that to productively manage the risks of dialogue requires us to identify those internal debates which have the greatest consequence for our external debates. In the era of globalization, it is likely that the subjects which connect internal and external debates have a lot to do with democracy, free markets, migration, poverty, environment, and social welfare. Each of these subjects carries with it very high stakes, not only because they are big subjects, but because they raise very complex tectonics between internal debate and external debate, wherever the line is between internal and external. So now I come back, having made a slightly more abstract journey using Islam and Europe, back to Mumbai's slum dwellers, and towards my conclusion, you'll be relieved to know we're almost there. It may seem like an excessive reach to juxtapose the struggles of Mumbai's urban poor and their practices of compulsory cosmopolitanism with the situation of Muslim communities and Islamic leaders as they conduct dialogue with their liberal or Christian counterparts in Europe. However, both cases involve what I earlier referred to as contested conviviality. By using the term contested conviviality, I wish to highlight the precarious, asymmetric, and risky space that is involved with any sort of conviviality across boundaries of class, gender, race, or ethnicity. This sort of conviviality is the global predicament of complex societies, diasporic meeting places, urban social formations, and trans-regional formations like the European Union, for example. Such contested conviviality is very different from the world of rational debate and dialogue in the imaginary Habermasian public sphere, whether national or transnational, since it rarely involves equality between the two parties involved. It is also quite different from what Sergio Costa, critically, in my view, rightly labeled the nostalgia program in post-colonial studies, issuing mainly from the decolonial turn in Latin American studies, since situations of pre-colonial purity are impossible to find on the ground. Impossible certainly in the case of Mumbai slum dwellers or in the case of Europe and Islam, but I will issue a general challenge to say in any real situation in today's world, show me a place where you can turn to something which is relatively untouched and all, it's close to impossible. To this extent, I'm in deep agreement with Sergio Costa's concern and question about this move, which comes particularly out of Latin American studies. So what I mean by contested conviviality is not only that conviviality has often got to be achieved in contexts of serious conflict, but the situations in which the very meaning and scope of conviviality may be under debate between the parties involved in such negotiation. Thus, contested conviviality is a meta term which refers to the conditions of negotiation about conviviality itself. Imagining such a negotiation is a challenge both to real communities in the world who are obliged to live with one another, but also to the human sciences, which need to question their own ideas about conviviality in order to capture the nature of this meta-debate, which underlies many struggles in the world today. And I very much look forward to the contributions that this enormous and exciting new initiative will make to this debate. So thank you very much for your patience.